Welcome to my channel. It was a quiet summer day in July 1996. Off the southern coast of England, in the calm waters of the English Channel, two local fishermen set out early, long before dawn broke the horizon. But that morning, their nets caught something unexpected. As they pulled their catch aboard, something heavy resisted. Not uncommon, sometimes it was debris, sometimes an anchor lost by another boat. But this had weight and shape. And the moment it breached the surface, one of the men dropped the net with a gasp. A man's body. Face down. Bloated. Lifeless. The water had not been kind, skin pale, hands swollen, clothes clinging to the body like a final layer of silence. But it wasn't the decay that drew attention. It was the object still strapped to the man's wrist. A Rolex Oyster Perpetual. A luxury watch. Timeless. That single, stubbornly persistent timepiece would become the heartbeat of a case that unraveled into something stranger than fiction, a tale of identity theft, betrayal, and murder. At the time, the body had no name. No wallet. No identification. Just a man, dressed in a button-down shirt and trousers, wearing ordinary shoes. The fisherman radioed the Coast Guard. The body was retrieved. The tide had preserved it better than most might expect. But one thing stood out even more than the Rolex. Tied tightly around the waist of the deceased, was an anchor. Not just symbolic. Not just metaphorical. An actual steel anchor, fastened with nautical rope, heavy enough to drag a body to the ocean floor. Whoever put it there knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a drowning. This wasn't a boating accident. This was a message, or rather, the silencing of one. Someone wanted this man to disappear. To be lost at sea, unnamed, unclaimed. But they underestimated two things, the persistence of the sea, and the precision of a Rolex. As investigators examined the Rolex, they made a critical discovery. Despite its time submerged in salt water, the waterproof casing had held. Barely, but just enough. Inside, the movement still worked. But here's where the magic of precision engineering collided with the logic of murder. The Rolex stopped ticking at the exact moment water finally breached the casing. That gave detectives an exact time of death. More than that, the serial number engraved on the back gave them a trail to follow. Every Rolex has a serial number, and this one had been serviced recently. The UK's Rolex Service Centre tracked the number, pulled up the service record, and matched it to a name, Ronald Joseph Platt. A Canadian national. A quiet man living in England. Mid-40s. No criminal record. No red flags. So the police thought they had their man. But what they discovered next turned the case completely on its head. As authorities began digging into Ronald Platt's life, they hit a confusing roadblock. Someone by the name of Ronald Platt was still alive. Still using bank accounts. Still driving. Still paying bills. Still existing. It wasn't a bureaucratic error. It wasn't identity confusion. It was something far more sinister. The man lying dead at the bottom of the sea was the real Ronald Platt. The man living under his name. A fraud. A ghost with someone else's face. That raised a chilling question: who was impersonating Ronald Platt? And why had he gone so far as to eliminate the real one? In the days and weeks that followed, police would piece together a portrait of Ronald Platt. Born in Canada, raised in England. A kind man. Reserved. Quiet-spoken. He was the type of person who would listen more than speak, help more than demand. Ronald worked as a TV repair technician and had always been fascinated by electronics. He was meticulous, detail-oriented, a man who found comfort in the predictable workings of wires and circuits. He had dreams, like most of us. Opening his own business. Building a modest but honest life. But what he didn't have, was capital. He needed help. And in the early 1990s, help came knocking. A well-dressed man calling himself David Davis offered to invest in Ronald's dream. Davis spoke the language of success. He wore fine suits, knew the right phrases, and made bold promises. He even offered to help Ronald move back to Canada, take care of the paperwork, fund the trip, help set him up again. Ronald, trusting by nature, accepted. He had no way of knowing that David Davis wasn't who he claimed to be. His real name? Albert Johnson Walker. A man who had already left behind a trail of lies, theft, and destruction on another continent. Who was the man pretending to be Ronald Platt? Who was the man still walking freely in England, using his name, signing checks, driving cars, opening accounts? That man, as it turned out, was not new to deception. In fact, deception was his craft. His livelihood. His way of surviving. His real name was Albert Johnson Walker. Decades before a body washed ashore in Devon, Albert Walker lived a very different life, one that seemed, on the surface, completely ordinary. Born in Ontario, Canada, Walker came from humble beginnings. A small-town upbringing. Conservative values. A family-oriented man, or so people thought. He got married, had children, went to church, and held steady jobs. But beneath that polite, buttoned-up exterior, something darker simmered. Albert Walker was ambitious. Not just in a healthy, upwardly mobile way, but in the ruthless way. He wasn't content with enough. He wanted more. And he wasn't willing to wait for it. In the 1980s, he reinvented himself as a financial advisor. He opened a business in Ontario, Walker Financial Services. He marketed himself as a man who could grow your wealth, a trusted Christian businessman who catered especially to clients from religious communities. And people believed him. Why wouldn't they? He was charming. Educated. Charismatic. The kind of man who remembered your children's names, who prayed with you after meetings, who made you feel secure. But it was all a facade. Walker wasn't investing money at all. He was running a Ponzi scheme. Slowly at first, and then with growing audacity, Walker stole from his clients. He promised high returns, safe investments, secure futures. Instead, he took their savings and funneled them into his personal accounts, luxury goods, travel, and shell companies. His victims weren't nameless corporations. They were friends, neighbors, even family members. Many of them were elderly. Retired. Living on fixed incomes. For a while, the illusion held. As long as new investors kept feeding the machine, Walker could pay the old ones just enough to keep suspicion at bay. But Ponzi schemes are like fires, they burn hot, and they burn out fast. By the early 1990s, things began to unravel. A handful of clients started asking uncomfortable questions. Audits loomed. Lawsuits circled. And then, in 1990, Albert Walker disappeared. Along with millions of dollars. And with him, he took something else. Something no one could have predicted. His teenage daughter. With a forged passport and a web of lies, Walker fled Canada and landed in Europe, eventually settling in England. There, he started over, from scratch. New country. New name. New identity. He introduced himself to the world as David Davis, a wealthy Canadian businessman with an elegant accent, a background in finance, and an attractive younger wife. But David Davis was neither Canadian nor wealthy. And the woman posing as his wife was his own daughter. Let that sink in for a moment. Not only did Walker create an entirely false life in England, but he forced his own daughter, still in her teens, to participate in a deception so bizarre it bordered on cultish. For years, the two lived under the same roof as husband and wife. They socialized. Traveled. Attended dinner parties. People around them assumed they were a couple. The daughter, reportedly isolated and emotionally manipulated, was trapped in a world not of her choosing. A prisoner in her father's long con. By the time Walker met Ronald Platt, he had already been living under the David Davis persona for years. Confident. Polished. Untouchable. In 1993, their paths crossed. Ronald Platt, trying to rebuild his life in England after business setbacks, was vulnerable. He was seeking opportunity. Stability. A fresh start. Walker saw it instantly. He saw in Ronald not just a kind man, but a target. He learned quickly that Ronald was Canadian, had few close contacts in England, and was still considering moving back to Canada. And to Walker, that wasn't just information. That was an opening. Under the guise of helping Ronald set up a new business venture, Walker offered to help him get back on his feet. He funded travel costs. Provided legal guidance. Offered a generous loan. And when Ronald finally decided to move back to Canada, Walker smiled and waved goodbye. Because now, the identity he wanted was available. The real Ronald Platt had left the country. And Albert Walker became him. For the next 2 years, Walker used Ronald's identity to build a new layer of deception. He used Ronald's name to open bank accounts, rent homes, secure utilities, and even sign legal documents. He told neighbors his name was Ronald. He signed checks as Ronald. He lived as Ronald. All while the real Ronald was thousands of miles away, unaware that his identity had been hijacked. But then, something happened that Walker didn't anticipate. In 1995, Ronald Platt returned to England. Not for long. Just for a short visit, to tie up loose ends. But that brief return posed a massive problem for Albert Walker. There were now 2 Ronalds in the same country. The lie, his entire false identity, was now at risk. All it would take was one government form, one bank visit, one police report, for the illusion to collapse. Walker had a choice to make: come clean, and face exposure as one of Canada's most wanted fugitives. Or, make Ronald disappear. Permanently. When Ronald Platt returned to England in 1995, it wasn't with fanfare or announcement. He didn't storm into the country demanding his old life back. He simply came home. Quietly. Unassumingly. He had unfinished business in the UK, financial matters to settle, a few people to see, and, possibly, hopes of staying long-term. But what he didn't realize, was that his name was already in use. That the man he had once called a friend, had turned him into a ghost. To Albert Walker, the return of Ronald Platt was like hearing a distant alarm, one that started soft, but grew louder with each passing day. He had been living under Ronald's name for nearly 2 years. Everything in his life, every document, every signature, every lie, depended on the real Ronald Platt staying gone. But now Ronald was back. Back in England. Back in reach of authorities, banks, landlords. If Ronald walked into any office and said, "That's my name," the entire house of cards would collapse. And Walker knew what was waiting for him if that happened: prison. Not just in the UK, but in Canada, where he remained a fugitive wanted for massive financial fraud. So he did what predators do when cornered. He stopped thinking like a conman. And started thinking like a killer. In July of 1996, Albert invited Ronald on a casual day trip. It was the kind of invitation you might expect from an old friend: let's catch up. Let's take a drive. Let's enjoy the seaside air. Ronald agreed. He had no reason to fear the man who had once paid for his flight back to Canada. No reason to think the offer was anything but generous. So he got in the car, and the 2 men, one real, one counterfeit, drove along the quiet coastal roads of Devon, England. No one knows exactly what was said. There were no witnesses. No traffic cameras. Just the 2 of them, and the sound of tires rolling along a lonely stretch of coastline. But what we do know, is that Ronald never came back from that drive. When Ronald's body was found days later by fishermen, there were no obvious signs of trauma. No bruises. No stab wounds. No gunshots. No ligature marks. In fact, Forensic pathologists struggled at first to determine the exact cause of death. One theory: he had been drugged. A sedative, possibly slipped into a drink or food, could have rendered Ronald unconscious before he was ever tied to the anchor. That would explain the lack of a struggle. That would also mean Albert Walker planned this. Not in a moment of panic. Not in a blind rage. But calculated. Controlled. Cold. The anchor tied around Ronald's waist was not random. It wasn't picked up at the scene or improvised in a moment of desperation. It was prepared. A heavy, rusted piece of steel, fastened with care and rope, looped multiple times to ensure it would hold. The type of anchor used for small boats in deep water. The kind meant to bury itself under waves. Albert Walker took Ronald's unconscious or possibly lifeless body, carried it to a secluded stretch of coast, and dumped it into the sea. He didn't panic. He didn't run. He returned to his life as though nothing had happened. Confident. Composed. Still answering to the name Ronald Platt. What he didn't realize was that he'd made one mistake. One small oversight. He left the Rolex. The Rolex Oyster Perpetual watch on Ronald's wrist was more than a fashion statement. It was a marvel of engineering. Waterproof. Shock-resistant. Precise down to the second. It was also traceable. Investigators noted that it had stopped working at a specific time, just after 10:25 p.m. on the night Ronald disappeared. That time, frozen in motion, gave them a time of death. The serial number on the watch. It traced back to Rolex headquarters. From there, to the watch's service history. From there, to Ronald Platt. And from Ronald Platt, to the address of the man still living under that name. Detectives were now on high alert. A man they believed to be Ronald Platt, was alive and walking around, even though his body had washed up on the coast with a Rolex that said otherwise. When police approached the man calling himself Ronald, they were met with a smooth-talking, confident Canadian. He didn't flinch. He didn't panic. He tried to explain everything away. But cracks began to show. Documents didn't line up. Stories shifted. Forensics began building a timeline, and that timeline placed Albert Walker with Ronald in the days before the murder. Soon, a search warrant was issued. What they found confirmed everything. Forged IDs. Financial records. Passport stamps. A mountain of fraud. And, most chillingly, evidence that Walker had planned Ronald's murder weeks in advance. Albert Johnson Walker was arrested in 1997. His real identity, now exposed, shocked everyone. One of Canada's most wanted fugitives was living comfortably in England, impersonating a man he had murdered. The international press exploded. How could this happen? How could a man fool so many people for so long? How could he drag his daughter into such a dark, spiraling life? But beneath the headlines was the brutal truth: Ronald Platt, a kind and trusting man, had been used. Used for his name. Used for his life. And ultimately, discarded, left to vanish beneath the waves. The arrest of Albert Johnson Walker sent shockwaves across 2 continents. In England, he was a polite Canadian businessman, a man known as Ronald Platt. In Canada, he was a fugitive, a criminal mastermind who had disappeared years earlier with millions in stolen funds. And now, in a courtroom in Exeter, Devon, he was finally unmasked. But this was no ordinary fraud trial. This was a murder case. In March 1998, Albert Walker stood before the court at Exeter Crown Court, charged with the murder of Ronald Platt. By then, the fraud was undeniable. Investigators had discovered a vast network of forged documents, fake identities, and years of deception. But what shocked even seasoned prosecutors was how long the charade had gone on, and just how easily it could have continued. The court wasn't just being asked to convict a conman. It was being asked to understand a man so committed to the lie, he killed to preserve it. The courtroom filled early each day. Journalists. Retired neighbors. Curious locals. People wanted to look him in the eye. The man who had called himself Ronald Platt, lived among them, smiled at their children, and dragged a body into the sea. Prosecutors laid out the timeline in painful detail. How Walker had befriended Platt. Gained his trust. Helped him return to Canada. Then quietly assumed his identity. And when Platt returned in 1995, unexpectedly, Walker's carefully constructed double life began to crumble. As the evidence mounted, so did the gravity of his choices. He had forged a man's life, and then extinguished it. The case against Walker was built on cold, meticulous facts. The Rolex on Ronald's wrist stopped at the exact moment of water infiltration. The anchor, tied with nautical rope matching one found in Walker's possession. Phone records placing Walker and Ronald in close contact in the days leading up to the murder. Eyewitness testimony from locals who had seen the two men together at a seaside pub just days before the body was discovered. Forgery documents showing Walker continuing to operate under Platt's name after Ronald's death. And perhaps most damning of all, the lack of emotion. During the trial, Walker never expressed regret. Never apologized. Never acknowledged Ronald's humanity. To Walker, Ronald Platt was just a tool. A name. A means to an end. But there was one voice the court had not expected to hear, Walker's daughter. Now in her 20s, she broke her silence in a closed session, shielded from cameras and the press. Her testimony was raw. Quiet. Controlled. But deeply human. She spoke of a life of isolation. Of years pretending to be someone's wife when she was only a scared teenager. Of manipulation. Control. Emotional abuse. She hadn't known about Ronald's death, at least, not at first. But she testified that her father had become increasingly paranoid in the summer of 1996. That he would disappear for hours without explanation. That he would destroy papers, shred documents, pace the floor at night. Her words painted a picture not just of a fraudster, but of a man spiraling. A man who knew the lie had grown too big to carry. Amidst the technical evidence, it was easy to forget the man at the center of it all. Ronald Platt. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't famous. He was a technician, a quiet man who loved electronics, who had dreams of one day owning a small shop and living peacefully. He trusted the wrong man. And he paid for it with his life. Friends and family described Ronald as a man of patience. A loyal friend. Soft-spoken. Generous. Honest. The prosecution reminded the court, this case is not just about identity theft. It is about a life taken to preserve a lie. A man betrayed, not by a stranger, but by someone who shook his hand. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours. On the charge of murder. Guilty. On charges of fraud and identity theft. Guilty. Albert Johnson Walker was sentenced to life in prison, with the judge recommending he serve a minimum of 25 years before parole could even be considered. In his closing statement, the judge didn't mince words, you lived a lie so convincingly that even you began to believe it. But the truth does not rot underwater. The truth, like that Rolex, keeps ticking, until someone listens. And with that, the door closed behind Albert Walker. After his conviction, Walker was eventually extradited back to Canada to face a mountain of additional charges, primarily for financial fraud. In total, his schemes had affected over 70 people, many of whom had never recovered their savings or peace of mind. In Canada, he faced more trials. More headlines. More victims. And in every courtroom, Ronald Platt's name echoed like a bell. Not because he was famous. But because he was the man who stopped the clock. The man whose quiet life became the thread that unraveled a monstrous lie. When a murder case ends in conviction, there's a temptation to believe the story is over. The bad guy goes to prison. The system works. Justice, in some form, is served. But stories like this don't end in the courtroom. They echo, through families, through communities, through time. After the trial, Ronald Platt was finally laid to rest. His body, recovered and returned to his loved ones, was given a proper burial in England, a country he had once considered home. Friends from different chapters of his life came together. Some had known him as the shy boy in Canada who tinkered with radios and took apart appliances just to put them back together. Others knew him as the gentle soul in Devon who enjoyed pub quizzes and walks by the sea. All of them spoke of the same thing, a man who didn't ask for much. Who trusted easily. Who believed people could be good. And that trust, ultimately, cost him everything. What does justice look like in cases like these? Is it enough to see someone behind bars? Or is there more we should learn from stories like this? Drop a comment below. What surprised you most about this case? How do we protect trust in a world full of deception? And what do you think you would do if someone tried to take your identity? Every story we tell is an invitation, not just to observe, but to reflect. If this story moved you, even a little, please like the video, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Every subscription helps us bring hidden truths to light. Helps us keep telling the stories of those who can no longer speak for themselves. So until next time. Stay curious. Stay compassionate. And take nothing, and no one, for granted.